Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. This season, we are talking with leaders inside organizations focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're talking with them about best practices and proven tools for positive change. We are also sharing vignettes from our new book, Allyship in Action, to help leaders take real, tangible action on DEI right away. This work is important because all humans need to feel seen, heard, and belonging in the workplace. Listeners, I'm so excited for this week's guest. Chela Gage is Head of Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Pratt and Whitney. As a partner and consultant to the business and talent organization, Chela is responsible for developing and creating the strategic long-term plan and initiatives to advance DEI for Pratt and Whitney Global Enterprise. She has more than 20 years of experience in talent and joined the organization in 2008 as an associate director in talent management, where she revamped the hiring and created a global talent acquisition center of excellence. In addition to supporting 40,000 employees and 6,000 hires across the globe, Chela and her team developed an in-source recruiting model for the U.S. while successfully streamlining and solidifying recruiting processes across the globe. She also has led teams within high technology, engineering, and automotive across Japan, Singapore, China, the UK, France, Brazil, and more. She's committed to advocacy in her work with California Kids Connection. I love that. Helping families to adopt through foster care. This work later led to the creation of the nonprofit Miles Above, which focuses on connecting emancipated foster youth with employment opportunities, mentoring, and sustainable housing. She also studied employment law at California Empire College of Law and holds a bachelor's degree from California State. Thanks so much, Chela, for being on the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie, for having me. It's amazing to hear your bio. You're like, oh gosh, I did that. Yeah, that did happen. Wow. Who is
20
that?
years. 20 years
Yeah.
I've been doing that.
I still feel like I'm in high school.
I know. It is. Time flies. Well, tell us about your journey. How did you get to be doing this amazing work?
Oh, thank you for that question. And, I want to take it back to 1984 when Reverend Jesse Jackson was running for president. I don't know if anyone remembers that, but I found myself riding on the shoulders of Jesse Jackson as he walked through the projects that I live in. I lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut at the time, which is not too far from our East Hartford Pratt and Whitney headquarters. I surveyed the crowd perched on his broad shoulders, and I saw the faces of proud women and men. I saw people just enamored with his confidence. And I saw him allow people to be themselves. If anyone remembers Jesse Jackson's, I am somebody. And I remember
it's so important to see as a young person, like I am somebody.
Yes. And to see yourself, like to see him as a Black man running for president in 1984. I was a young girl at the time. I won't say how much because our listeners can probably do math, but I knew at that time I wanted to be somebody that made a difference. And so how I got into this seat today, the Monday after the killing of George Floyd, my peers and I were scheduled for a meeting. And at the time I wasn't in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I was still in talent acquisition. And this was our diversity review, so to speak. It was already scheduled. And a friend texted me that morning to ask if I was ready. And in my head, I was like, ready for what? In my life, I've had my fair share of trauma. So I was ready to compartmentalize and push through. Like I was thinking, we'll just take that weekend and I'll deal with that weekend after work. But that morning, there were so many that, in addition to that text, so many people called me. And in their undertones, Julie, I heard pain. They were asking, what should they do? Should they go to the next meeting? People were asking, how should they feel? They were asking permission to be in pain. They were wondering if their pain was seen, if we as a company valued them. They were wondering if those in power would help. So I didn't compartmentalize. Instead, I spoke up and I humanized the experience. We were at a table, a virtual table at the time, because by this time we were all working from home. But there was about 18 of us, and myself as a Black woman, there was another Black woman there. And I shared that as a mom, a wife, an aunt, and sister, I am often confronted with the experience of losing a loved one because of the color of their skin. Regardless of how hard I work or what my title is in a company, how much education I have, sometimes gender and skin color lead the rest of the conversation. That weekend, a man that looks like my husband, my brother, my sons, my nephews died in front of us. That weekend, many people were wondering, what do we value about each other? And so I thought about that moment of Jesse Jackson, and I thought about what I saw in people looking up at him. And I decided at that time that it was time for me to do something different. And I'd like to tell you that my path went straight from the shoulders of Jesse Jackson to being an accomplished lawyer, because that's what my goal was. But before law school, a lot happened, and I had to build a little resilience. Between the ages of 7 and 17, my mother moved me from Connecticut to Georgia, and I lived in 12 foster homes and 4 group homes. I lived with Christians, Seventh-day Adventists, Hispanic families, white families. Talk to any kid in foster care in Georgia, and they'll say these things. Not everybody in the South can cook, and it doesn't always taste great. Don't unpack until week 2. A lot of clothes fit in Black garbage bags. To this day, I hate the sight of Black trash bags, and I'm so grateful that Costco sells white ones. Girls in group homes really can fight in high heels, and families are complicated. In hindsight, I've learned a lot more. I've utilized what I've learned growing up in my years in talent strategy, and today I utilize them in DE&I. And I know that people want to be seen, they want to be appreciated, noticed, and validated. We each have a story to tell. There's a story deep down in all of us, and everyone wants to be somebody. So that's how I got into the role that I'm in today.
Wow. Ah, thanks for sharing the pain in your past. And I can only imagine foster care and moving that frequently between
Yeah,
families. And I'm sure that's inspired, like a huge part of the work you do in supporting nonprofits
yeah,
today. Yeah.
yeah,
It's always that full circle moment of I know what it's like and I want to help. That
yeah,
I love when you see that full axis, Shayla, in your story.
yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And
Thank
you're
you so
so
much.
right. We have to see it to believe it. Like the
We
Jesse
do.
Jackson, like it's like someone like me is saying this, is like running for president. Like, so I love so much about having a Black female vice president right now. Like our kids, thankfully, will never know a world where this isn't possible. I mean, president
Yes,
be better, but VP will take it for now.
yes, yes. I loved when Barack Obama was president, and I follow hip hop, but there's a Jay-Z lyric that says, "My president is Black."
Yeah.
And for that, I have 3 boys, and I remember when he was going for it, and my son at one point said, "He looks like me," and I was
Mhm.
like, "Yes, baby, he does look like you. You can be
Mhm.
president too."
Yeah, and he's awesome. What a fantastic leader. So many great examples. Shayla, I'm so curious, in the work you're doing inside the firm with DEI, it sounds like a major, pivot with George Floyd, 2020, up to all the wild cards we've been through the last few years. I love that diversity was already in the forefront. And so it made it easier. There were a lot of organizations like, oh, shoot, we're behind. We got to like get with it, and just felt very opportunistic. So it's nice to hear that. What has the path been like? Take us
Yes.
from May 2020 to now. What have you
Oh,
learned about
oh my
DEI?
goodness. There's been so much. I'll tell you, my team's purpose today is to position diversity, equity, and inclusion as a cornerstone of Pratt and Whitney's culture. We have a DE&I action plan, and within that plan, we plan to accelerate the education of our workforce, foster an inclusive culture, and improve representation across all employees globally. When I first got into the seat, one of the first things my CEO said was, okay, we have managing inclusion training, but what is that teaching what is that teaching our workforce? And do we have people that are comfortable being their best selves? So I did a listening tour, and a couple of things that I heard is people were like, "Show me the data."
The
I want to
business
know.
case.
Right, right, right.
So
Can you share with
boring, but
me?
necessary.
It is necessary, right? And there's always the quantitative and the qualitative ways to show how DE&I is making progress. So they said, show me the data. They said, we were already on a journey for Paradigm for Parity. And during that journey, the goal for Paradigm for Parity is for us to have 50% females in leadership positions by 2030. And we started this journey in 2013, where we were closer to probably 13%. And now we are at about 34%. And so
Kudos, that's pretty good.
it is, we did a lot of work. And what I realized is if we took our successes with Paradigm for Parity and took that over for representation for all,
Love that.
then we can make some strides, right? And one of the things that we did with Paradigm for Parity is we were vocal about what we intended to do. So my CEO said, let's tell everybody. So we did what we call the Stand Up for Inclusion. We had around 15,000 of our employees from around the globe came together to virtually stand up for inclusion. And
That's
our
cool.
executives, it was so fantastic because our executives shared personal stories. I believe that storytelling is a way to humanize DE&I.
Yep.
There's a story in all of us. They shared stories from microaggressions to allyship and privilege. We had a fireside chat between a white leader and a Black leader where they both talked about what it meant to be an ally, one of being an ally and one of receiving allyship. Our ERG leaders, like our employee resource groups, they briefly shared painful stories that they had a bias both inside and outside of the work. Following the event, we shared resources of DE&I to all of our employees. I received so many calls. I was only a month in during that time. And one of the calls I remember, it was a gentleman, he said, Chela, I've been with Pratt for over 18 years. I work in the shop floor. I'm a white man with tattoos and 2 earrings. You look at me and you assume I think a certain way, but people don't know, some people don't know that I'm married to a Black woman and I am raising interracial kids.
Oh,
isn't that? And he said,
beautiful.
I feel like Pratt we're really on a road to inclusivity in a way that I haven't seen us before.
That's like the best feedback you can get.
Julie, every hard moment that I have from the killing of George Floyd through where we are today with now, inclusion is diversity, equity, inclusion used to be like church and state. Well, shh, don't talk about it. Not at the table. But
Well, that's how
now
we were raised and taught. I know I
yeah,
was like, shh, don't talk about race. Oh my gosh, that person has a disability. Don't say anything.
Don't say anything. Well, it'd be more like there's veterans, but shh, there's LGBTQ plus.
Yeah. Right. It's just such a weird thing that we've had to unlearn, I think, especially for our generation. And so you don't blame the white guys that are like, I'm not supposed to talk about that. But then there's more to me too. Like there's more to me than meets the eye, like the tattooed white guy, right? Like you can make so many assumptions about that guy. And he's like, here's what you don't know about me. And Chela, one of the things I love is exactly what you're sharing. Share your diversity story, but like, what's one thing about you you wish other people knew?
Right.
Like what's not packaged up? What's not obvious about me? Like it's like that iceberg, that model, like what's beneath?
What's beneath the surface?
Because we can't be our full human selves at work if we can't show our authentic full selves.
Yes. So we have a 3-prong approach to diversity right now when it comes to humanizing it. With our executives, we have a My Why for DE&I, and our executives share why DE&I is important. For me, it was important for the organization to understand from our CEO to our VPs that when we're talking about diversity of slate, or when we're talking about diverse candidate pools, when we're talking about recruiting from historically Black colleges and Hispanic serving institutions, our employees need to pull in and remember that this executive said this is important to him because his family came in as an immigrant, through immigration, or that this leader said his mother was a teacher working in an underprivileged school. Like humanizing that type of experience, right? So that when we really go do the hard moves that really move that glacier, people are like, this is why we're doing it. Yeah. So on top of that executive, my why for DEI, we created a DEI Task Force, and the recruiter in me came out. So we posted the roles. We had people apply, and within the DEI Task Force, this is that frozen middle, no executives here. So we asked for people who were interested in DEI to help us understand why Pratt isn't as inclusive as we want it to be, and then help us come up with strategies that will make us be inclusive. And some of those strategies, they had evaluating our values. Is DE&I embedded in our values? One was making sure that our employees on the shop floor have resources to be a part of employee resource groups. Within Poland, we wanted our employees to be able to share their stories. And so sharing how to create and craft your story so that others understand and connect it to its values. And then we have what we call courageous conversations. And within the courageous conversations, this is really almost like a podcast, but it's video. And we're pulling on our ERG leaders to talk about sometimes the painful stories of being excluded. For Engineers Week in February, we talked about what it's like to be a Black engineer. And sometimes what that road looks like. It's not always straight lines, especially for those who are underrepresented in the college space. And on top of that, we as an RTX company put out our first transparency report. And a lot of other companies have this, where we were transparent about, and I call it transparency report, but most companies call it their DE&I report, their annual report. And what we did was we shared, here are all of our 10 employee resource groups. How many employees are a part of the resource groups? Here's our representation. We shared our representation for the first time as a company. Pratt & Whitney is a 97-year-old company, almost 100 years, and we shared what that global representation looks like. And within 2022, where I see us going with this is multiplying our inclusive culture through focused education and inspired learning. I want something where people are immersed in training. I want more than just sitting in the seat and looking at a video or going through a cohort. So we've created something called inclusion, the Inclusive and Belonging Leader Certificate. So it's a learning experience that will help employees develop competencies and confidence to lead inclusively. It's self-directed and multi-modal. It has e-learning, instructor-led, and experiential learning. So we have mentors assigned to our employees. The mentors are supposed to make sure that the employee has this experience as they learn awareness, as they learn allyship, and navigate that experience through ERG involvement, get to know sessions. These individuals will host DE&I events, and then they'll create a continued learning path. Now, when they're done, here's what I love, because we're an engineering-based company and we love to have accomplishments, right? We need to execute something. So once they're done with their training, they'll receive a badge. And if you've ever seen those badges on LinkedIn. Oh yeah. I know. So I won't hype the company name in here, but we worked with the company that does those badges on LinkedIn. And so once these individuals complete the training, they'll be able to say that they are a Pratt Whitney ILBC certified. They are an That's inclusion cool. Certified leader. I'm so happy about that.
Yeah, a badge of honor. I mean, that's a great signal. Like, hey, I want to be one of the good people. Like, I want to be a good human
Yes,
in the workplace. I
I've got
think
my badge.
I've been doing a lot of LinkedIn learning lately. And yeah, at the point I'm like highly motivated to finish the course to put it on my profile, right? Like, I want people to see this. Like, I'm doing the work too. I'm studying this. So, Shayla, wow, you're busy. You're very
Just a
active.
little bit. Just a little
It's a lot. Thanks for
bit.
so many leaders, ask me that question. Okay, what should be in my DEI plan? I'm like, well, can't tell you that. Like, you need to figure that on your own. But what you just laid out, I mean, listeners, write that down and see what would work in your organization. I mean, don't copy and paste, but those are a lot of really good ideas. I love the transparency report.
Yes,
Be,
yes.
and to be clear, if you're not doing that and you're hiding those numbers right now, like people know you're not hiding
They call
anything.
you out. They
And
do.
your clients, your board, if you're in the stock market, people will be asking that question and
Very
they
true.
will evaluate whether to work with you based on the answer to that question. So just get
Very
it over with and get better.
and get better. Don't be afraid, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes we're like, I need to be in the green. Let's show your journey. Red,
Yeah.
amber, green is just a way to to track what you're doing. It doesn't say everything that you're doing. There's
Mm-mm.
quantitative and qualitative ways to measure DNI. And there's not one thing, there's 3,000 things. So show
Yeah.
it all.
Yeah, I love the mix of representation numbers, which it's a lagging indicator, but an important metric. I mean,
It
that's
is,
what we're trying to do is diversify
right?
key areas of DEI, and then the inclusion factor, right? Because we know you can recruit all day, but they're not gonna stay if it's not inclusive. So, employee
Right.
engagement data, like whatever data you have on the effectiveness of inclusion, the perception of inclusion in your workplace, like quant and qual together shows a pretty good transparency report. So I
There
love
we
that,
go.
Shayla.
I love
And the senior leadership, that my why for DEI. How cool is that? I
it.
always start every program with that. Like, why does this matter to you? Why'd you show up today? And
Yes.
people are a little hesitant at first, especially folks that, feel like they're quote unquote not diverse, which, your story with the tattooed gentleman certainly proves that most of us have a human diversity story,
Yeah.
time when we felt different or at, current state moment. But that why, if you don't have the why, like you're just not going to do the hard work. I know you're going to like go on to the next shiny object. Like you're just not going to care about this long term. So that why
Yeah.
and amplifying that. I was meeting with a CEO and a leadership team yesterday, and they were really frustrated that frontline managers, the frozen middle, like you called them, I call them the magic middle, all sorts of things for these folks, but they're not engaged. They're just not as engaged in DEI as we'd like to in most organizations, the middle band. So many reasons why, lots
So
vying for
many.
their time, yo-yo,
Yes.
always competing priorities. Get it. But the
Yes.
CEO was like, it's an excuse. Like they're just not in it. He was so angry, old white guy. It's just great to see him all fired up. And he's like, that's it. It's mandatory. Like
It's mandatory.
and I was
Oh
like,
my
oh,
goodness.
in my mind, I was like, I
There we
don't
go.
know. I don't
Yeah.
know. But I
Okay.
did encourage him. I said, okay, if you want to make it mandatory, I hear you. And they need to hear your why. They
They
need to
need.
hear your why as a CEO, why this is important, and they need to hear it more than once. Like you
They
need to do some
do.
short videos or something and get in
Yes.
front of people and
Yes.
capture their hearts and minds that this is
Yes.
important and this isn't just I'm in trouble. Shoot, I gotta go to this training because that
No,
doesn't feel
yeah.
good.
No, you got to catch them in the fields. You got to, and you know what I love about a lot of executives right now, and sometimes what I hear, their my why for DE&I is a lot different than a millennial or Gen X, a Gen Zer,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
Millennials, Gen Zers, and I hate those labels, but those of those generations have come up with a more diverse um, population of friends, right? And whereas the generations before, we kind of moved in cohorts with our friends and coworkers and peers together. So what I hear from senior leaders is their my whys sometimes are the result of their children being more diverse.
Oh
Like
yeah.
it's like my son just came out as trans, or my daughter just went through the military and had this, you won't believe the experience. Or I went to a Black Lives Matter with my family. And this was as a result of my children. And I love that because there's always something, there's a pivot, right?
Yeah. It's like, oh, I'm
What,
awake now. Yeah.
yes. What is that pivot that has now changed everyone? And we all have different reasons for making our pivot.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. It is through the lens of children. I mean, that's my why. I always start out my why in any talk I give is I've got 3 girls, white girls. So there's advantages there, able-bodied, straight, cisgender, at least to my knowledge right now. But they're girls, and gender
Yeah.
equity is a sad state right now. I mean, we're dealing with some pretty tragic things with women in the workforce. So that's my why. And I want, my 8-year-old is so curious about diversity. Like, she's like, I want friends that aren't white. Like, why do I have so many white friends? She's like really like genuinely curious and is like, that's not fair, mom. Racism doesn't make sense. I know. You're right. She's like, I don't understand why we would do this to people. They're human beings.
There's human, see, yeah, and it's that thought. One of the things that I always say, and what I think people resonate with, is on this journey, we are trying to make our insides match our outsides.
Yeah.
And meaning, if in the building, does our representation, does our culture, does it match where we live and work? Does it match the culture and what our employees, when they leave work, what they go aim to do, right? Is there a way that we can have a hybrid model of inclusivity at work, that people can be their whole best selves when they're in the building, and they're not just waiting for 5 or 6 or 7 o'clock to come around for them to let loose and be themselves. It's like, bring us all.
Yeah, it's so, God, 12 years in corporate America, it's been a long time, but I remember that feeling of walking out the door and just wanting to like untuck my shirt and take my belt off, And I remember a colleague saying, like, don't do that because people can still see you. Wait till you get to your car. And it's like, oh, when do I get to be me? Like, the whole point is like, I'm not me. Like, I'm clearly stuffing something inside myself to exist at work, and just desperately want to break free of that, which is so fun with the future of work. It will be different.
It will.
Speaking of which, Shayla, I'm so curious, as we return, as many organizations are returning, to the physical workspace or hybrid model. I mean, there's no easy solution to this, but I know a lot of leaders like you are. How do we make it inclusive? Like, this is a great pivot, a great reset moment. How do we make the office space inclusive?
I think, just like you said, a lot of organizations are going to have to figure this out, because for the past 2 years, we've been sourcing talent outside of our normal sourcing, where we go find people. For example, our headquarters is in East Hartford, but we've recruited people that are working for East Hartford, and maybe they live in Georgia, or maybe they live, and I know that maybe they live in Ohio. And so one of the best things, there's always I don't know if you've heard the pro and the con to the pandemic, the pro pandemic pieces, and one of the pro-pandemic pieces is Zoom or video technology. Because what I love and what I've heard people say is, on the 12 box, my box as a Black man is as big as the person's box next to me.
Oh, it is equitable. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, that's a good point.
And so the question is, and one of the things that I've heard is individuals that are underrepresented or people of color have said, people now, when I'm on my Zoom box with the 12 block or the 9 block, whatever it is, if I'm hesitant, everyone can see it. I'm no longer hiding or being able to be invisible around the table. I am as visible as everyone else. Everyone can see when my hand is raised. Everyone can see when I have a point. And the struggle for organizations today is to create a workforce, a place in which people can still feel as included, although they may be working remote, because you've hired them, you've done the sourcing, your aperture, you've included locations that you haven't included before. And so now, can we continue the Zoom? Can we continue the video equity? Can we continue that in our life space, in our real spaces? And I think there are advantages to investing in a flexible work model that include the opportunity to evolve existing learning and development processes. Like extending the walls of the traditional classroom to a virtual environment can create a more inclusive environment. One of the things I've heard from our global employees is that now with people that are I live in California, but my company is East Coast. And now I understand what it's like when people say, oh, you're not in East Hartford. And so there's in our
It is
global
with that
employees.
face, like, oh, you're not here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, you don't belong.
Or it's like, oh, we do that.
Yeah.
We hire
Shock.
people outside of
Yeah.
like, oh, look at us. And it's like, yes. So now when we go back to our hybrid workforce, one of the things our company is doing is we're having role segmentation, because there are some people who had to work through the pandemic this whole time,
Yeah.
on site and on location. And we don't want to devalue their experience. But there are some people who are returning to work because their roles intersect with those who have been in the office the whole time.
Yeah.
And it's making sure that the teams can still connect. And it's making sure that the trajectory of path for success that we used to have this, you have to be in front of someone's face, or if Joe Bob is going to the meeting, you got to go to the meeting too. No, we are really that certificate that our team is creating, that inclusion and belonging leader certificate. Being inclusive is being a good leader.
Yeah.
So
synergistic.
It's one and the same. Yeah. So not only are we helping leaders with diversity, equity, and inclusion, but this is just good leadership.
Yeah, I love that. I couldn't agree more. I started my business kind of on the heels of doing leadership training and consulting in corporate. And so a lot of early on, 7 years in, my first few years are just leadership training, but it happened to be more with women and more with minority groups. So that's how I kind of got. And then I started to see people like, you can do diversity for a living. Like, oh, shoot, I want to do that. And so it's been this progression for me. But a lot of the tools I use when I teach about allyship and inclusive leadership and DEI are things I borrowed from my leadership day. It's through the lens of inclusion. I think there's always a lens we need to put on it that weaves in the specific aspects of diversity and inclusion, because it's not just, same old leadership training. It's leadership training with a bit of a twist. But you're right. And the more I think leaders recognize that if I get good at empathy and I get good at vulnerability and coaching, like I get more for my team, which means I have more time back in my day and I spend more time with my family and I'm less grumpy. And,
and that's where I think, so one of the things that traditional teaching has taught us for that frozen or magic middle is, in order to be a good leader that moved from individual to a leader, I still have to be a taskmaster.
Yeah.
And being a taskmaster is not synonymous with being a vulnerable, empathetic leader.
Exactly.
And so now we have to merge the two, because vulnerability is something that is not, one of the things that COVID-19 did for a lot of organizations, it allowed us to see what's happening in the background of people's lives.
Yeah.
So being on Zoom, being on video, you've seen where someone's kid, just can't take it anymore and they're coming in for a hug.
Oh my gosh, they want a hug.
Or we've seen where employees are caregivers for parents now, or we've been a part of teams where it's a team of 10 and each 10 has lost someone because of COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
And that sense of being human, that empathy that we extended during our pandemic can be extended outside of the pandemic as well. And that's how we create inclusive leaders that allow employees to be their whole best selves at work.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. That point you brought up about the taskmaster, it's like having all the answers, being in charge. Like that was reverend, right? Kind of in the old days. Yeah. Being not vulnerable, being stoic, being right was valued. And, there's a shift. There's a shift happening with inclusion of, hey, maybe we really want people that when they don't know the answer, they just admit it. Like,
They don't know.
and more importantly, they include other people that do know instead of having to do all things and be all things for all people.
Oh,
Like, what a relief for everyone.
yes,
So
yes.
it's just
I think
letting go of that old, outdated model.
diversity of thought is key.
Mhm.
Like making sure that your go-tos are not your standard, the people that you went to high school with or college with, or the people that you're working on the same team. You have to go to the people who are on the phrase, people who you don't normally go to and get their opinions,
Yep.
recommendations. I really think that diversity of thought, I think that inclusion is the engine of innovation.
Mhm.
And without inclusion, you cannot be innovative because diversity of thought does not exist.
No, well said. And we know we have so much data to support innovation rates with diverse and inclusive teams far
There's the business
surpass.
case.
And we're in a hyper competitive marketplace. Like, who doesn't want to out innovate their competitors? And it's really hard, by the way, to a competitive advantage, your people, your culture. That's super hard to replicate for your competitors, too.
There you go. Right. If that's one of the things that within aero and defense, one of the things I love about aero and defense is it can create generational wealth because it's one of the long-term industries that is sometimes overlooked. But
Yeah.
we've got employees that have been with us for 20, 30 years. But one of the things that is key about the industry is we are now being pulled on from Google, from
Mhm.
Amazon. Our talent is leaving us because of the high tech. But our culture is one that cannot be emulated. It cannot be. When you think of Quarters 5 and the threat of new entrants and
Yep.
all of that, culture is one. And I love how you just said it. With our culture, we keep planes in the sky. What we do is so important. And to make sure that our middle managers understand that bringing, letting someone be real, letting someone be authentic with, hey, we just saw this on the news and I really don't feel like showing up at the next meeting. I
Yeah.
mean, just think about everything that's going on across the globe right now
Yeah.
and letting people have a moment to embrace that, the world is kind of icky. And maybe we should talk about that before I go into my next to-do list. And
Right.
then,
Give people
because,
space to breathe.
yeah, and less distractions if you really just get it out on the table.
Yeah. Get it out. You're going to do better work. Just like
Yeah,
acknowledging that bad things can happen. And
yeah,
rather than have to stuff it or pretend like it's not happening or mentally shift gears, like just get it out. And then
yeah,
I know for me, my creativity flies after that. And I think it does for most people. Oh, Shayla, I could talk to you forever. We'll have to do a part two. It's just so good. So
yeah.
good. I love the plan. I mean, thanks for letting us in on your DEI plan that you worked so hard on. Like, that's
Yeah, thank you for that.
beautiful, listeners. And I think the key takeaway I'm having from the conversation is you got to be intentional. You
Yeah,
got to be consistent with DEI, and you
yeah,
got to get all the leaders on board with it. And I love that my why exercise.
yeah,
Shayla, tell our listeners anything we haven't discussed or a takeaway you'd like to leave in
yeah.
this conversation.
Yeah, I think one of my takeaways is that I want people to know is we all have a story, and you never know what someone is dealing with in the background. Not only dealing with, but you'll never know how you can connect with someone outside of what's visible, their race or their gender,
Yep.
unless you ask them about themselves. And that human connection, that's how we hold hands, lock arms, and make sure that the quantitative meets the qualitative when we talk about DE&I journeys and DE&I successes.
I couldn't agree more. You don't know. You don't know until you get to know somebody. Don't
Yeah,
judge.
yeah, yeah.
Beautiful, Shayla. Well, tell our listeners, how can they follow you, connect with
Ah,
you, see what you're up to?
thank you, thank you. So yeah, I'm on LinkedIn heavily, thanks to my communications team and I. So I can be found on LinkedIn at Chela, Chela Gage. On Twitter and on Instagram, I'm tweet at Che, TWEETATCHE. So that's how I can be found on social media.
Thank you so much, Taylor. This has been
Thank you, Julie.
Such an incredible conversation.
Thank you for the time.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Allies are necessary for positive change. If you are on the journey to becoming an ally, we invite you to participate in our brand new Lead Like an Ally online program, or get a copy of our new book, Allyship in Action, available on Amazon. Both are helpful tools that meet leaders where they're at and help provide tools for professional and personal settings. Head over to nextpivotpoint.com to get started today.